It was supposed to be a quiet morning. In the sleepy suburb of Tualatin, Oregon, just 15 miles south of Portland, spring was beginning to stir. Dew clung to the grass, and a soft haze curled over the rooftops like steam from a forgotten cup of tea. By 5:30 a.m., the streets were still empty. The only sound was the distant rustling of fir trees, a breeze drifting through the peaceful cul-de-sacs where families still dreamed behind locked doors. Then, 3 sharp cracks, loud enough to wake the birds. Bang, bang, bang. The echo rolled down Maplewood Lane like thunder, shattering the stillness. Windows lit up. Curtains fluttered. A dog barked frantically from behind a white picket fence. Somewhere, a baby began to cry. By 5:36 a.m., the first 911 call had come in. There were gunshots. I think it came from next door. Please, just send someone quickly. Another call came 2 minutes later. Then another. Then silence. Dispatch immediately flagged the location. A 2-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a modest complex called Swan Hollow Residences. It wasn't a place known for crime. The most excitement usually came from the occasional noise complaint or a raccoon in a trash bin. But this? Gunfire? The Tualatin Police Department treated it as a high-risk situation. Within minutes, a nearby SWAT team was mobilized. 5 marked vehicles and 2 unmarked cruisers surrounded the complex. By 5:45 a.m. officers in tactical gear moved in silently, rifles raised, scanning balconies and windows as neighbors huddled behind doors. Unit 204. That's where the calls had pointed. The apartment was quiet now. No movement. No sound. Officer Calvin Reese, 17 years on the force, was the first to reach the door. He later told investigators that something felt off before he even stepped inside. The air was heavy, tense, the kind of weight that hung around death. There was no answer when they knocked. The door was locked from the inside. They breached it at 5:52 a.m. And then, everything stopped. The entryway opened into a tidy living room. Soft carpet. Shelves of books. A piano tucked neatly into the corner, its surface dusted and polished. A page of sheet music still open on the stand, Debussy's Clair de Lune. But in the center of the room, 2 bodies. A woman slumped near the edge of the couch, her legs curled beneath her like she had collapsed mid-step. Blood soaked through her blouse, 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. Her face was peaceful, almost too still. Like porcelain. A man lay face up on the floor just 3 feet away. A single bullet wound to the temple. His hand was still slightly outstretched, as if he had dropped something. That something was the gun. A Sig Sauer P320. Compact. Reliable. Common. Nearby, 7 shell casings glittered on the carpet. The entire apartment was eerily intact. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. No signs of struggle. There were framed photographs on the walls. Wedding pictures, vacation snapshots, holiday dinners. One photo showed the couple smiling at a beach, arms around each other, the sun setting behind them. It looked like a home. A life. A love story. But this was no accident. This was deliberate. Sergeant Dana Mulroney, one of the first to examine the scene, would later describe the moment as the one that finally broke through her professional detachment. I've seen murder-suicides before. But this felt intimate. Too quiet. The gun was almost placed, not dropped. Like it was the final note in a composition that had already been written. The woman was identified as Melissa Carter, 29 years old. A local piano teacher. Beloved in the community. The man was David Anderson, 35, her husband. As more officers arrived and began processing the scene, the neighborhood watched from behind curtains and cracked windows. Word spread fast. A crime scene van rolled in. Yellow tape went up. Reporters began circling within the hour. No one could make sense of it. Melissa and David? The young couple who always smiled, who waved hello, who decorated their porch for every holiday. Just the night before, one neighbor had passed them walking hand in hand with their dog, chatting about where to get coffee the next morning. They looked happy, she said, her voice shaking. I waved to Melissa. She smiled like always. Like nothing was wrong. But something was wrong. Something deeply, horrifically wrong. As the sun rose higher over Tualatin, the shock began to settle into a collective grief. A quiet horror. Whispers turned into stories, and soon those stories began to reveal the cracks beneath the surface. What unfolded next would send ripples through the community, not just because of the tragedy itself, but because of what it exposed, the hidden life behind locked doors. The silent suffering of a woman who played beautiful music but never screamed for help. And the man who, once hailed as a hero, became the instrument of her end. But that morning, before anyone knew the whole truth, all that remained was blood on the carpet, a piano left untouched, and a melody that would never be played again. Long before her name was printed in police reports, before her face became part of an evening news montage framed in solemn black, Melissa Carter was known for one thing: her music. To most people in the neighborhood, she was the quiet girl who taught piano out of her living room. The one who baked cookies for her students, who remembered birthdays, who played Silent Night during the town's Christmas fair and River Flows in You on stormy Sunday afternoons. But to those who knew her best, she was more than just the music teacher. She was gentle, deeply intelligent, and fiercely passionate, though few ever saw past her calm exterior to recognize the fire underneath. Melissa was born in 1996 in Duluth, Minnesota, the only daughter of two high school teachers. She was the kind of child who hummed while walking to school and who, according to her father, could identify composers by ear before she turned 10. She got her first piano at age 6, a weathered second-hand Yamaha upright with 3 chipped keys. It sat awkwardly in the corner of their small duplex, but to Melissa, it was a cathedral. Every day after homework, she would play until her mother had to gently remind her it was time for bed. Her childhood was filled with music competitions, school recitals, and long drives to out-of-town auditions. By her late teens, Melissa had already performed at regional showcases and won a state-level scholarship to study performance at the Minnesota School of the Arts. It was there, during her sophomore year, that she made an impression on her mentor, Professor Harriet Lang, a veteran concert pianist and notoriously demanding instructor. Melissa wasn't just technically skilled, Lang would later say in a televised interview. She had the presence. There was a stillness in her performance that made people listen. It wasn't flashy. It was honest. After graduation, Melissa turned down an offer to join a touring ensemble. She wanted something smaller, more personal. She moved to Oregon in 2021, drawn by the coastlines, the quiet, and the creative community in Portland's southern outskirts. There, she settled into a modest apartment complex and began building a life around the one thing that never let her down: music. She started teaching piano to children and adults alike, turning her living room into a makeshift studio. By 2023, she had over 15 regular students, ranging from 7-year-olds plunking out Twinkle Twinkle to retirees returning to Chopin after decades away. Her students loved her. So did their parents. Not just for her teaching but for the space she created: warm, patient, gentle. A small whiteboard near her entryway always had the same handwritten message in soft green ink. Green circle, you don't have to play perfectly. You just have to play honestly. That was Melissa's philosophy, in music and in life. She wasn't particularly social, more introverted than shy. She attended local chamber performances, volunteered at youth workshops, and occasionally accompanied choirs at the Unitarian church down the road. But for the most part, she lived quietly. Neighbors recall her tending a potted herb garden on her balcony, walking her rescue dog Bailey each evening, and greeting delivery drivers with a soft smile and a generous tip. So when she met David Anderson, it felt sudden. He was different, confident, talkative, charismatic in a rugged sort of way. A former Marine with sharp features and a firm handshake. He had recently moved into the same complex and ran into Melissa at a tenant meeting about parking space assignments. According to Melissa's friend Lena, he approached her first, complimented her piano playing, which he'd heard drifting through the shared walls, and asked her out for coffee. It was fast, but Melissa didn't seem nervous. In fact, she seemed hopeful. She told me David made her laugh, Lena later said. She hadn't dated seriously in a while, and I think she felt seen, maybe for the first time in a long time. Their relationship progressed quickly. By mid-2022, they were living together. By December, they were married in a small courthouse ceremony, no guests besides 2 witnesses. Friends were surprised but supportive. David spoke often about protecting her, how she grounded him. Melissa, for her part, glowed in the early photos. She looked at him with a soft pride, like she believed, truly, that she had found someone who understood her silences. But behind those photos, cracks were already forming. Her lessons grew shorter. Students noticed she began canceling at the last minute more frequently. Bailey, her dog, was seen less and less on their usual walks. When asked, Melissa would smile and say she was adjusting to married life. But something in her tone had changed. By mid-2023, she told Lena she had stopped attending weekend workshops. "David doesn't really like when I go without him," she said. It was brushed off at the time. A minor detail. Not unusual for newlyweds. But it was the small things that piled up. Melissa stopped playing publicly. She removed the whiteboard from her entryway. The green ink was replaced with silence. One of her students, an 11-year-old girl named Olivia, noticed Melissa's hands trembled slightly during lessons. Sometimes she would get really quiet after texting someone, Olivia said. She'd just stare out the window and not move for a long time. Still, she never complained. She always smiled. In the final video she posted, just 2 months before her death, Melissa is sitting at her piano, performing The Swan by Saint-Saëns. The recording is soft, slightly shaky, like it was filmed on an old phone propped against a stack of books. But her playing is pristine. The camera catches a brief moment at the end, Melissa glancing sideways, her eyes darting toward something off-screen, and then, cut. That was the last time most of her friends saw her alive. When the news broke about the tragedy in Unit 204, it didn't feel real. It didn't match the image people had of her. And maybe that was the tragedy within the tragedy, that someone so full of beauty, someone who spent her life helping others find their voice, had spent her final days slowly losing her own. But in those who remember her, her music still lingers. So, honest. Unfinished. Before the headlines labeled him a murderer, before his name was whispered in disbelief at neighborhood gatherings, David Anderson was someone's son. Someone's brother. To many, he was a man who had once served his country, who had shaken hands firmly and looked people in the eye. To Melissa, at least at first, he was a man with depth. David was born in 1990 in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the youngest of 3 boys in a military family. His father was a logistics officer with the U.S. Army, his mother a school nurse. Structure was the foundation of his upbringing. Discipline wasn't a punishment, it was expected. From the age of 10, David woke himself up at 5 a.m. to run with his father before school. He made his bed with military corners. He answered with, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am." That discipline followed him into adulthood. After graduating high school in 2008, David enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, and by 2010 he had been deployed to Afghanistan as part of a reconnaissance unit. He completed 3 tours over 6 years, each one harder than the last. He returned home with a chest full of medals, and a silence no one could explain. According to fellow Marines, David was reliable in combat but distant during downtime. He drank little, spoke less. He followed orders, carried out missions with precision, but seemed detached from anything unrelated to survival. He never snapped, one squad mate later told an investigator. But it was like, he never really came home either. In 2016, David left active duty with an honorable discharge. He moved to Oregon with the hope of starting fresh. With GI Bill support, he earned his real estate license and found quick success selling homes in Portland's booming suburban market. His ex-colleagues described him as intense but professional, organized, focused. By 2018, he had closed over 50 property deals in just 2 years. But real estate is a volatile world. And David was not made for volatility. When interest rates climbed and the housing market cooled in 2020, his sales began to falter. His confidence took a hit. Clients started complaining about his demeanor, too rigid, too impatient. Then came the lawsuits. In 2022, 2 clients accused David of misrepresenting property conditions. A formal investigation was opened. By November 2023, the Oregon Real Estate Agency revoked his license. That single moment unraveled everything. Without a license, David couldn't work in the field he'd invested years into. He tried to pivot, freelance consulting, short-term gigs, but nothing stuck. As weeks turned into months, his routine collapsed. The man who once awoke at dawn to run drills now slept past noon. Melissa, quietly, began carrying more of their financial weight. But David couldn't see that. All he saw was failure. And failure, to someone trained to suppress emotion, was unacceptable. His military past gave him a sense of pride and identity, but it also haunted him. VA records later revealed that David had been flagged for symptoms of undiagnosed PTSD, though he never followed up on referrals. He declined therapy. He refused group support. And slowly, the cracks in his self-control began to show, not with fists or explosions, but with controlling behavior, sharp words, long silences that carried menace. Melissa's friends noticed the change before she ever admitted it. She started answering texts hours late, her best friend Lena recalled. Or sometimes not at all. When we met up, she'd say David didn't like it when she went out too much. That he was just adjusting to everything. Behind closed doors, things were worse. One night in late 2023, Melissa confided in her neighbor, Mrs. Reynolds, a retired librarian who often brought over muffins and herbal tea. She told me David had raised his voice. That he smashed a coffee mug during an argument, Reynolds said. She didn't say he hit her. But she looked down when I asked. That told me enough. David had begun lashing out, verbally first, then with gestures that crossed lines. Slamming doors. Kicking furniture. On one occasion, Melissa told Lena that he had threatened to revoke her health insurance if she kept pushing him. She laughed as she said it, like it was a joke, but her eyes never matched her voice. Power, to David, had always been about control. When he lost his income, he clung to what remained: the apartment, the schedule, Melissa. But control disguised as care can only hold for so long. One night in January 2024, David had a breakdown. According to Melissa's private journal, later found by police, he had accused her of hiding money from him. When she denied it, he went to the closet, pulled out a locked case, and retrieved his legally owned Sig Sauer P320, a gun he hadn't touched since his discharge. He didn't fire it. He didn't aim it. But he held it long enough to leave Melissa frozen, terrified. Then he collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. He kept saying, "I'm not like them. I'm not broken," she wrote. But I think he was trying to convince himself more than me. Melissa chose to stay. Partly out of love. Partly out of fear. And partly out of the quiet, consuming hope that things would get better. But things didn't get better. By March 2024, David had withdrawn nearly every dollar from their joint account, just under $10,000. He claimed it was to pay off debts, but no records ever confirmed that. His phone history showed searches for firearm ballistics, painless death, and most hauntingly, how long does it take for someone to be forgotten? That question still lingers, echoing through every photograph they left behind. To outsiders, David was a man in transition. A struggling veteran trying to rebuild. A husband who waved politely at neighbors. But inside his apartment, behind the locked door and polite facade, he was unraveling. And Melissa, gentle, graceful Melissa, was too alone to stop him. At first glance, Melissa and David looked like the kind of couple that belonged on the cover of a small-town magazine. She, the quiet music teacher with soft smiles and a gentle voice. He, the former Marine turned real estate agent with sharp posture and a steady handshake. Together, they gave the impression of balance. She softened him. He grounded her. Neighbors, friends, and even casual acquaintances often described them with one word: stable. But stability, it turns out, can be just another word for silence. They met in the summer of 2021 at a tenant association meeting in their apartment complex. David had just moved in after downsizing his lifestyle. Melissa had already been there for over a year. Their connection was quick. Too quick, some would say in hindsight. Within weeks, they were spending nearly every evening together. Walks around the block. Dinner on the balcony. quiet conversations that lingered into the night. Melissa's friends were cautiously supportive. They noticed her smile more, speak more. But they also noticed something else. David was always there. He would pick her up from lessons, walk her to the store, wait in the car during rehearsals. At first, it seemed sweet, protective. But over time, it felt possessive. One of her fellow instructors at the local music center, Mark Elwood, remembered a moment that, in retrospect, felt off. We were finishing up a youth recital, and I asked Melissa if she wanted to grab coffee with the other teachers, he said. She hesitated, glanced at her phone, and said David was already in the parking lot. Waiting. Small moments. Little things. They didn't stand out at the time. But like fine fractures in glass, they were beginning to spread. In December 2022, they married quietly at the county courthouse. No big ceremony, no family flown in, just a signature and a shared ring. Melissa explained it as a personal choice. We're both private people, she told Lena. We just wanted something simple. She never mentioned that David didn't want her parents involved. She never mentioned that he had dismissed her idea of a music-themed wedding in a garden. That he had raised his voice the first time she brought it up. What, so we can waste money on a piano in the middle of a field? He reportedly said. It's not a performance, it's a marriage. And so, she gave in. They moved into a new apartment together a week later. Melissa brought her piano. David brought a wall of medals and framed documents from his Marine days. The apartment was neat. Minimalist. His style more than hers. Over time, the soft colors she loved disappeared, replaced by cooler tones, darker curtains, and stricter rules. Don't leave dishes in the sink. Don't run the dryer after 9 p.m. Don't invite people over without asking. At first, she adapted. Then she adjusted. Then she began to disappear. Her lesson load shrank. She dropped 2 evening classes, citing schedule conflicts. She stopped participating in weekend recitals. When asked, she'd offer polite reasons, a migraine, a personal errand, something came up. The excuses were vague, but the pattern was clear. She was fading out of the life she had built. Inside the home, David began controlling more than just the schedule. He reviewed their shared bank account daily, questioned every small purchase. Once, he reportedly returned a birthday gift Melissa bought for a student and accused her of not respecting the budget. The item was a $15 metronome. Her emotional world began shrinking to the space between 4 walls. And yet, to outsiders, they still looked like the perfect couple. They attended community potlucks, posted holiday selfies, smiled for photos at a friend's baby shower. There was no screaming in public, no bruises, no scenes, because David didn't need to yell. He only needed to imply. He only needed to say things like, "You're lucky I'm patient. If I were like my father, this wouldn't be a conversation. Do you think your piano pays the bills?" Each comment wasn't a blow, but each one left a bruise on the inside. One neighbor, Mr. Fields, recalled hearing muffled arguments through the thin apartment walls. Not shouting, not like TV fights, just sharp words, long silences, then a door, then nothing. He never reported it. Didn't seem serious, he admitted. And you know, couples fight. Couples fight. But not all couples begin to vanish in plain sight. In late January 2024, Melissa tried to rejoin a local ensemble group she had left months prior. She attended 2 rehearsals, her first public appearances in weeks. She played beautifully, but during both sessions she was visibly anxious. Checking her phone. Leaving early. Apologizing too much. When one of her colleagues casually asked how David was doing, her face froze for just a second. Then she smiled. "He's okay. We're just figuring things out." A week later, she sent an email resigning from the group. No reason given. In February, things escalated. Melissa missed a payment on her business license renewal. She stopped updating her student schedule. Some parents began pulling their children from lessons, citing uncertainty. Still, she never said a word about what was happening at home, even when asked directly. One parent, Mrs. Talbot, pressed gently after her daughter came home and said Melissa looked really tired. I asked if everything was okay, Talbot recalled. Melissa said yes, then paused, and said, I just haven't been sleeping well. It's probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was a life coming apart at the seams, held together by quiet smiles and careful lies. And behind it all was David, watching, waiting, tightening the boundary lines. His grip wasn't physical. It was strategic, built on doubt, guilt, emotional leverage. When Melissa spoke about wanting to travel home for the summer to see her family, David reminded her they couldn't afford it. When she expressed a wish to take on more students, he questioned if she was strong enough to handle it. I think you're overestimating yourself, he said once, and underestimating what I've done for this relationship. She believed him. Or maybe, more tragically, she needed to believe that things could still be fixed, that their problems were just friction. That marriage was hard for everyone. That love was enough. It wasn't. But by the time Melissa realized how far she had drifted from the shore, she was too deep to swim back. If someone had looked just a little closer, just a moment longer, maybe everything would have turned out differently. But in stories like this, the signs are rarely obvious. They don't arrive in screams or sirens. They come in whispers, in half-finished sentences, in hesitant smiles, in eyes that look away just a second too long. Melissa Carter had always been a quiet person, thoughtful, reserved. It was part of what people loved about her. But in the months before her death, that quietness began to change. It became heavier, less peaceful, more like a silence that had been forced to grow over something it didn't know how to contain. Her best friend Lena noticed it first. It started with canceled plans. Then came the slow replies to texts. Then the calls that went straight to voicemail. She said she was busy, Lena recalled. But even her voice felt different. Flat. Like she was there, but not really. One evening in February, Lena dropped by Melissa's apartment unannounced, something she hadn't done in over a year. David answered the door. He was polite but cool. Said Melissa wasn't feeling well. That she was sleeping. That she'd call later. But she didn't. And when Lena finally reached her days later, Melissa apologized profusely. Said she was just exhausted. That David had been taking care of her. That everything was fine. But the apology felt rehearsed. Like something she'd practiced in front of a mirror. Around the same time, one of Melissa's students, a 12-year-old girl named Sophie, made a passing comment to her mother after a lesson. Miss Carter looked sad today. Like she was about to cry, but didn't want anyone to see. Her mother brushed it off at first. Teachers have bad days too. But it stuck with her. The next week, when she picked Sophie up from her lesson, she stayed a moment longer than usual. She watched as Melissa adjusted her student's posture, gently corrected her hand position, just like always. But when their eyes met, the smile Melissa gave her was delayed and tight around the edges. That night, the mother sent Melissa a kind message. Just checking in. I hope you're okay. If you ever need anything, we're here. Melissa responded 3 hours later. Thank you so much. That means more than you know. 3 simple sentences. But there was no emoji. No exclamation point. No warmth. Another neighbor, Mrs. Reynolds, the same elderly woman who had shared muffins with Melissa on Sunday afternoons, recalled a moment that stayed with her long after the police tape was taken down. She came over for tea, she said, voice trembling. We sat on the porch. It was sunny. I asked how she and David were doing. She smiled and said, he's having a tough time. I'm just trying to be there for him. But she kept twisting the napkin in her hands. Her knuckles were white. Then, something she said casually caught Mrs. Reynolds off guard. I just wish I could sleep without checking the door 3 times. She said it with a laugh. As if it were a joke. But it wasn't funny. One of the clearest moments came from Melissa's old piano student, Olivia, who had returned for a single refresher lesson after a year away. Olivia, now a high school sophomore, adored Melissa. But when she walked into the apartment that day, she said it didn't feel the same. It was so quiet, she said. Like, emotionally quiet. Not peaceful. Empty. She also noticed something else. The whiteboard that had once sat by the front door, the one that used to say, "Play honestly, not perfectly," was gone. In its place was a blank wall. And on the piano bench, Melissa sat stiffly, like she was holding her own body together. She smiled but never made eye contact. When Olivia asked how she was doing, Melissa nodded and said, "I'm still playing. That's what matters." Later that night, Olivia told her mom. It didn't feel like a lesson. It felt like a goodbye. But even as these quiet warnings emerged, no one truly saw the full picture. Not yet. Because Melissa was trained in silence. She knew how to mask discomfort with grace. How to redirect concern with a well-placed compliment. How to disappear without looking like she was running. It wasn't that no one cared. It was that Melissa had become very good at convincing people she was okay. Even when she wasn't. Even when she had bruises hidden beneath sweaters. Not physical ones, but bruises in her spirit. The kind that form slowly, each word of doubt, each small act of control, each guilt trip, each manipulated moment, layering over one another until they weigh more than a person can carry. And maybe the saddest part is this. She didn't want to bother anyone. In her final journal entries, later discovered inside a small lockbox under her bed, Melissa wrote things like, "He gets angry, but I know he doesn't mean it. Maybe I'm not doing enough to help him feel secure. I just want things to go back to when it was simple. I want to be loved the way I used to be." The handwriting was clean, precise, musical even. But between the lines, it was easy to read the melody she was no longer playing out loud. She was afraid. But more than that, she was ashamed. Ashamed that she had chosen the wrong person. Ashamed that she had let him into her life. Ashamed that leaving him would mean starting over, alone, again. And so, like many women in her position, Melissa chose to wait. She chose hope. She chose silence. And that silence, over time, became a prison. Not made of bars, but of good intentions. It was still dark when Melissa woke up. According to the smart home system later accessed by investigators, the apartment's hallway light flickered on at 4:58 a.m., triggered by motion. Just 2 minutes later, a lamp in the living room came on. That was the beginning of the end. But let's back up just a few days. On March 5th, David Anderson made an unusual bank transaction, a single cash withdrawal of $9,800 from his personal checking account. The amount was just below the $10,000 reporting threshold for suspicious activity. According to his banking records, this was nearly his entire remaining balance. There were no follow-up payments. No checks deposited. No purchases made. The money simply disappeared. That same day, surveillance footage from a local gas station showed David buying a single pack of cigarettes and sitting in his parked car for over an hour, unmoving, staring forward. Later that evening, he returned home and said almost nothing. Melissa's journal entry for that night was short. "He's quiet. Quieter than usual. Something feels off. But I don't want to make him worse." On March 7th, Melissa was seen grocery shopping alone for the first time in weeks. She bought tea, eggs, fruit, and a small bouquet of white lilies. The cashier said she smiled, but only with her mouth. That night, she played piano for exactly 23 minutes. Her final piece was Butterfly Waltz. No one else heard it, except David. Sometime after midnight, David reportedly began pacing. The neighbors below, a retired couple named the McKinleys, said they heard soft thumping across their ceiling for nearly 45 minutes. Footsteps, slow and constant. "I thought maybe they were rearranging furniture," Mr. McKinley told investigators. "Now I wish I'd called someone." At 5:01 a.m., a heated argument broke out. One of the neighbors, a young woman named Tara, heard it clearly through the thin apartment walls. "It wasn't shouting at first," she said. "It was like urgent talking. Tense." Then her voice raised, and I heard him yell, "Why do you always make me the villain?" That's when I sat up in bed. Then silence. Then 3 gunshots. Tara immediately called 911. "There's gunfire. Second floor. I think someone's hurt. Please, hurry." The dispatcher marked it as a high-risk domestic incident. Within minutes, a local SWAT unit was en route. Inside apartment unit 204, the horror unfolded in less than 90 seconds. From the trajectory and forensics report later compiled, it became clear. David shot Melissa twice in the chest, at close range. The angle suggested she was standing, possibly facing him. There were no signs of defensive wounds, indicating she likely didn't resist. She collapsed near the edge of the couch, where the blood pooled beneath her. David then turned the Sig Sauer P320 on himself, firing a single round into his right temple. He fell backward, one arm stretching toward the gun that now lay just inches from both bodies. At 5:08 a.m., their smart thermostat adjusted automatically, sensing no movement in the room. By 5:36 a.m., the first officers arrived. The rest you already know. But what many don't realize is that David didn't just snap. He prepared. The withdrawal. The isolation. The emotional decay. It was a slow, calculated erosion of self-worth, of trust, of reality. Melissa had become both his mirror and his shame. Every reminder of who she was before him became a wound he couldn't control. And in the end, he did what abusers with power often do. He tried to own the ending. The scene they left behind was haunting in its stillness. The apartment was pristine. The groceries Melissa had purchased were still in the fridge. A white lily sat in a narrow vase by the piano. A half-burned candle gave off a faint lavender scent. On the kitchen table, 2 clean coffee mugs were placed side by side. One had a crack down the side. The police found no signs of forced entry. No struggle. No defensive wounds. The sheet music on the piano had been closed. A symbolic silence. Even the family photos remained perfectly aligned on the wall. But nothing about the image was peaceful. It was a museum of what once was, a still-life portrait of a home where hope had been suffocated, slowly, until it could no longer breathe. The evidence that sealed the story. The weapon was confirmed as David's, legally purchased in April 2023. His fingerprints were the only full set recovered from the grip. The ballistics report matched all 7 recovered casings. The angle and pattern of Melissa's wounds suggested she was not expecting the shots. David's phone history in the week leading up to the shooting included searches like, "Can a gunshot be heard through walls? How long does it take to die from chest wound? Is murder-suicide a crime if both die?" He left no note. But he didn't need to. The silence of that apartment said everything. For days after the police cleared the scene, Unit 204 stood quiet. The yellow tape had come down. The door was locked. But the entire complex felt different. As if something sacred had been broken inside those walls. Not just lives, but the sense of safety that the neighborhood once took for granted. Residents walked their dogs a little faster. Kids played with a little less noise. And whenever someone passed by the second-floor balcony where a potted white lily still sat, they didn't make eye contact. No one had the heart to remove it. Melissa Carter's death didn't just stun her students, neighbors, and friends. It shook an entire community that had once believed itself immune to tragedy. The investigation findings. On March 10th, the Tualatin Police Department held a press conference. It was brief. At this time, we can confirm the incident was a murder-suicide, with no additional suspects involved. All forensic evidence, including fingerprints, ballistic trajectories, and digital records, point to Mr. David Anderson as the sole perpetrator. There were no dramatic revelations. But what made it worse was the lack of mystery. No forced entry. No defensive wounds. No long suicide note with hidden motives. Just a man who had unraveled, and a woman who had been too quiet for too long. Melissa's body was released to her extended family in Minnesota. Her parents, both retired schoolteachers, flew in with the help of a GoFundMe organized by her former professor at the Minnesota School of the Arts. Within 48 hours, the fundraiser had reached $12,300, much of it from parents of former students, fellow musicians, and complete strangers who had only heard her play once at a holiday event. One donor left a message. "She taught my daughter for only 3 months, but her kindness changed our lives." Another simply wrote, "We failed her. I'm so sorry." Her funeral was held on March 18th in a modest chapel in Portland. The piano from her apartment was transported to the service, polished and silent. A framed photo of Melissa sat beside it, her in a white dress, laughing mid-performance, hands lifted above the keys. No recording played. Instead, her students, some as young as 6, placed single white flowers on the piano bench, one by one. The room was quiet except for the sound of tissue being unfolded. After the service, Melissa's ashes were returned with her family to Minnesota. They planned to scatter them near a lake she used to visit during childhood, where she first heard Debussy's Clair de Lune, played by a local trio on a floating stage. David Anderson's remains were claimed by no one. He was cremated anonymously by order of the county medical examiner. The community reaction. In the weeks that followed, something began to shift. The local school district introduced new mental health outreach programs, including a partnership with the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Emotional Abuse. Melissa's former students began organizing a small concert in her honor. Neighbors created a memorial garden in the courtyard of Swan Hollow Residences, one patch of earth where parents and children could plant something living in memory of something lost. But among these gestures was also something colder, heavier. People began asking questions. Why didn't anyone see this coming? Why didn't Melissa say something? Why didn't we ask more? Listen harder. One neighbor, Mrs. Talbot, was especially vocal. We always tell ourselves we would notice if something was wrong. But Melissa smiled. She played music. She made cookies for kids. That's the face of someone who's suffering. There was guilt, but also a quiet fear that this wasn't just a one-time tragedy. That maybe this happens more often than anyone wants to admit. What the files revealed. When Melissa's private journal entries were made available to her parents, and later shared publicly with permission, a painful portrait emerged. He says I'm the only thing keeping him together. That if I ever left, he wouldn't survive. I used to think that was love. Now I think it's something else. I lied to Lena again. Told her I was fine. I'm not. But I don't want her to look at me like I'm weak. I miss who I was before this marriage. Before I had to manage someone else's emotions all the time. Each entry read like a whisper from someone fading. Melissa had never filed a police report. She had never called a hotline. She had never spoken a single word of her suffering in public. But she wrote. And in her writing, she told a story that too many people recognized far too late. In her silence, Melissa had become one of the many faces of an epidemic we're still learning how to name. Not just domestic violence, but emotional erasure. The kind of abuse that doesn't leave visible scars, but slowly convinces someone that their pain isn't valid, their needs don't matter, and their voice isn't worth hearing. Melissa Carter is gone. But what happened to her is not unique. It didn't begin with a gunshot. It didn't begin with a fist. It began, like so many tragedies do, with love. With belief. With hope. With a quiet person who thought she could hold everything together, including someone who was slowly falling apart. Across the country, thousands of women are living the same quiet story Melissa lived. They smile. They show up to work. They keep the fridge stocked, the curtains drawn, the music playing. But inside, they are managing chaos. Not always loud chaos. But the kind that manipulates, controls, isolates. It's called coercive control, and it's still not a crime in most states. Domestic violence by the numbers. In the U.S., 1 in 4 women experience severe intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Among women who are murdered by a current or former partner, more than half showed no prior police report. Emotional abuse often precedes physical violence by months, sometimes years. Victims with partners who own firearms are 5 times more likely to be killed. Melissa never called 911. She never filed a restraining order. She never left. But that doesn't mean she didn't try. Because trying to survive emotional abuse isn't always visible. It's not always running down the street barefoot or hiding in a shelter. Sometimes, it's staying calm while someone accuses you of betrayal for going to the store. Sometimes, it's making excuses for bruises that no one can see. Sometimes, it's looking in the mirror and saying, "This is just a phase. He's stressed. He's broken. I can help." And sometimes, it ends in silence. The psychology of collapse. David Anderson was not a monster. He was not born evil. He was a veteran. A man who had once believed in service, in order, in being needed. But when his life unraveled, he wasn't equipped to ask for help. He wasn't taught how. The military taught him to endure. Civilian life asked him to feel. And when he failed at both, he lashed out, not in one moment of rage, but through a slow spiral of control, fear, and desperation. This doesn't excuse what he did. But it does explain why stories like Melissa's happen, again and again, when we treat mental health like weakness and teach men that losing control means losing identity. It explains why so many women are forced to become caregivers, crisis managers, therapists to their own partners, and why they often stay too long, hoping the man they fell in love with is still in there somewhere. What we must learn. Melissa's story is not a warning. It is a mirror. It reflects the systems we still haven't built. Laws that recognize psychological abuse before it turns fatal. Resources that don't require bruises to take someone seriously. Communities that know how to check in gently, but persistently. A culture that teaches both men and women that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Melissa should not be remembered only for how she died. She should be remembered for how she lived. With grace. With patience. With music. A life filled with beautiful notes, silenced not because she failed to speak, but because we still don't know how to listen. Behind every tragedy like this is 100 missed moments where something could have changed. Maybe it was a question never asked. A gut feeling dismissed. A friend too polite to press. A stranger who assumed it wasn't their place. Maybe it was you. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was all of us. And so we say this. If you are in a relationship where your voice has gotten smaller, where your choices are questioned, where you feel like you're walking on eggshells, even when nothing is wrong, say something. To a friend. To a hotline. To anyone. Because silence won't save them. And it didn't save her. Melissa's music may have ended, but what she stood for, the right to live fully, freely, and without fear, must play on.